Good afternoon. I'm Mike Nichols. Thank you very much for joining us for our PMOPA safety webinar on IFR departure procedures from planning to the en route environment. I'm very pleased to have with us today Tom Turner, who's the Executive Director of the American Bonanza Society's Air Safety Foundation. Tom, thank you very much for joining us. Many in our community know you, Tom, from your years of leadership in general aviation safety. For those who don't know Tom, a very brief background. He has a master's degree in air safety, focused on pilot training and passenger safety. He served in the United States Air Force. He's published several books on safety, and he's a frequent contributor via articles, programs, webinars, just like this one on aviation safety. He was inducted into the National Association of Flight Instructors Hall of Fame and named a National Fast Team Representative of the Year in 2010. And another important fact from our perspective is that Tom was very instrumental in helping the PMOPA Safety and Education Foundation launch our M-Class Elevate training program. Tom, thank you very much for taking time from your busy schedule to join the PMOPA community and present this webinar. I'll turn it over to you. Oh, one more note, we're going to do Q&A at the end. So I'm going to ask folks, if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A portal, which you'll find the link to that in the bottom center of your screen, and we'll cover those at the end of Tom's webinar. So now, Tom, thanks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate being given the opportunity to participate in your program, which is, as Mike said, I was in on some of the early meetings about your program, but I've really watched what you've been doing, and I think it's fabulous. So congratulations on that. We're going to talk about instrument departures. As Mike said, I'm Tom Turner. I'm Executive Director of the American Bonanza Society's Air Safety Foundation. I've been here about 22 years. And ABS is kind enough to permit me to do some of these outreach programs. So if you're seeing the screen behind me, I'm in the fabulous American Bonanza Society studio in Wichita, Kansas. When I'm supposed to be sleeping, I also do something called Flying Lessons Weekly. It's on my Mastery of Flight website, which is just thomaspturner.com. I guess you'd have to call it a blog. I do something once a week or so called Mastery of Flight. And I look at recent aviation mishaps and try to draw positive lessons from them, as well as get substantial participation from some really nice readers and some big names in the industry sometimes who provide their comments and help us learn from them as well. So if you're interested in such things, check it out at thomaspturner.com. But let's get to this. We're going to talk about instrument departures. It's been my experience as an instrument instructor, and I've been doing that since 1989, that one of the most common shortfalls I find in pilots when I'm providing an IPC or any other sort of instrument instruction is a good plan for making an instrument departure. And it's most important when you are operating out of a non-towered airport, although the process of making an instrument departure is also important when you're flying in a controlled environment as well. Now, we all track, and this is intentionally blurry, but we all track our proficiency and our currency, recency of experience for instrument flight in our logbooks. And what we are required at a minimum in order to be considered, have the recent flight experience to be considered proficient in acting as pilot in command in instrument conditions or on an instrument flight plan, is that we have logged within the previous 6 months at least 6 instrument approaches, and they can all be the same kind now. They don't have to be different types like they used to be. Holding procedures and tasks, and then intercepting and tracking courses through the use of navigational electronic systems, which would be really hard. It would be hard to do the first 2 items without doing this as well. But if you log these things at a minimum in your pilot's logbook, you are considered to be current to act as pilot in command under instrument flight rules. There is more detail about the conduct of an instrument proficiency check in the Instrument Airplane Airman Certification Standards. Specifically, there's a table in the appendices that tells us what areas of operation from the ACS we must fly to check ride proficiency in order to earn an instrument proficiency check endorsement. Now, if you log those simple things that we said from the regulation earlier, you don't have to get an IPC. Uh, Chances are pretty good that you didn't practice everything you might be called upon to do in the process of recording six approaches, holding procedures, and navigational skills. So an IPC is a really good idea regardless, to make sure that from an objective standpoint, the viewpoint of an instrument instructor, that you in fact do have the skills that are going to keep you and your passengers safe in the airplane. That table tells us what we need to do to call it an IPC. And if you look at the list of all of the things in the ACS that we were required to do, you'll notice that it does not include the task about departure procedures. And so there is no requirement to either have recent personal experience of departure procedures and be considered legal under the regulations. And there's no requirement to be evaluated on departure procedures if you go the IPC route. We simply don't pay that much attention to the process of getting from the ground into the en route environment in instrument conditions or under instrument flight rules. And so that's what we're going to talk about here, how you get from the ground into the IFR environment. Takeoff minimums are, under Part 91 of the Federal Air Regulations, are voluntary. We can take off under pretty much any conditions we want to. And so we could make a near 0-0 takeoff. I wouldn't want to do it myself, but we could make a near 0-0 takeoff conditions takeoff legally under Part 91 of the Federal Air Regulations. So we could be launching into some pretty nasty weather from the get-go. As soon as we get into the airplane, we get into the air, we might be in the clouds. So it's very important to know how to do that safely if you elect to do that. Even if you have higher standards like I do. For example, a lot of pilots will require at least the minimums required to fly to the approach and use to the airport they are departing before they will allow themselves to depart into it. Personally, I adhere to having at least circling minimums to that airport before I will launch into the clouds. Because again, this gives me some options if something goes wrong shortly after takeoff. I have a pretty good chance of being able to fly and approach back into that airport if I needed to right away. But those are voluntary. Another possibility is that you have a departure alternate somewhere nearby your departure airport. For many years, I flew out of Cleveland, Tennessee, which is northeast of Chattanooga. It's in the hills. It's in sort of the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. And at that airport, it was fogged in a lot, or at least had low clouds a lot, because it was fairly high field elevation for that area, about 800 feet or so, if I remember. And the particular airport at the time, which is not the new current airport, but the old airport that was there at the time, was sort of in a notch surrounded by some low hills. And so it tended to collect clouds and low reduced visibility. And it might be that the NDB approach, which was the approach that was in use back then, so I'm dating myself a little bit, would not permit me to get back to that airport. But very nearby, I had the ILS-equipped, tower-controlled Chattanooga commercial airfield. It was several hundred feet lower in field elevation and almost always had substantially better conditions than we had up at Cleveland. So there were times when I made a calculated decision that I would depart, but I would have my approach briefed for that ILS down at Chattanooga. I would have the radio set up with the information in the backup so I could flip over very quickly and fly that approach if I had to. So I considered this to be a reasonable substitute for being able to fly back into the airport that I had departed. Actually, chances are pretty good that I would have been able to get onto the ground at Chattanooga sooner than I would have had I flown an approach back into Cleveland, even if I was going to be able to make that approach and break out. You might choose to have at least approach minimums, circling minimums, or a nearby departure alternates briefed and set up ready to go. And from there, choose the minimums that you're willing to accept. In any of these cases, you have to have a plan. How are we going to safely do these things and get up into the en route environment? All right, so we take off and we climb up into the clouds. What sort of clearance do we need to have? What can we expect? Instrument departures are charted based on the assumption that you will be at 35 feet above the runway height as you cross the departure end of the runway. And I actually drew it a little high here because 35 feet is less than a wingspan above the ground level. So a pretty shallow initial takeoff. But again, this is what the FAA uses to determine whether or not some special procedures are required to be stated for you to be able to get safely out of there under IFR. They assume 35 feet when you cross the runway threshold. From that point, unless there's some sort of non-standard statement, the procedure requires that you be able to climb at least 200 feet per nautical mile until you're at least 400 feet above the ground level. And that gives you some obstacle clearance. As a matter of fact, this gives you a little additional clearance over the minimum standard, which is based on 152 feet per nautical mile. And when you get, if you follow this, because your actual minimum climb gradient is greater than the charted minimum, you'll be 1,000 feet above the obstacle identification surface when you're 25 miles away from the airport. And this is what everything is based on, flying at least 200 feet per nautical mile, basically until you get well away from the airport, unless a procedure exists that stipulates something different. Now, what's that mean in terms of vertical speed? Really easy to do in one of the M-class airplanes. If your ground speed is between 90 and 120 knots, you need to be between about 300 and 400 feet per minute to be able to do that. You need to climb consistently, and where people get in trouble is where they do not transition smoothly to the gauges and hold a precise attitude to get a precise climb speed. And they allow the airplane to descend below this minimum gradient. But if you fly the airplane appropriately and you maintain a really modest rate of climb, you will meet the requirements, again, unless something different is specified. Every instrument departure procedure that we're going to discuss starts with the same initial profile. Maintaining at least 200 feet per nautical mile, call it 400 foot per minute rate of climb in your airplane. You climb runway heading straight ahead until you were at least 400 feet above ground level. And this is really important because it features in accident reports where pilots are making instrument departures or nighttime departures where the visibility is essentially IFR out the front of the airplane. If they maintain wings level, runway heading to 400 feet above ground level before they do anything else, chances are everything's going to turn out just great. It's the ones who don't climb straight ahead to 400 feet and try to go ahead and turn on course sooner that we read about, unfortunately. From this 400 feet point above ground level, there are several different ways that you can transition into the approach or the cruise, the en route environment. The first is called a diverse departure. Next is a diverse vector area departure. We're going to talk about each one of these in detail in a moment. Obstacle departure procedure, standard instrument departure, a visual climb over the airport, and sort of the catch-all for anything else, what I will call a do-it-yourself departure. So let's talk about what each one of these really means to you as a pilot. First, the diverse departure. The diverse departure essentially means that there are no obstacles, and you can climb to 400 feet and go whichever way you were filed to go from there. Pretty common out here in Kansas, with some exceptions we'll talk about in a little bit. Climb to 400 feet straight ahead. Continue your climb at least 200 feet per nautical mile, at least about 400 feet per minute. I'm sure you can do better than that. And you will be above this obstacle plane in all directions. This will keep you at 25 miles away, at least 1,000 feet above obstacles, and in mountainous conditions, you'll be given different minimum climb gradients as necessary to be at least 2,000 feet above the ground in mountainous areas. But this is really common out here in the flatlands. Climb to 400 feet, then as filed, go. The next is a sort of a version of this, which is called the diverse vector area. And this is where you will be getting radar vectors up to the minimum vectoring altitude. Now, it's a little easier now to find the MVAs online than it used to be, where they weren't published anywhere where pilots could see them, but it's still not really easy to find out specifically what the minimum vector altitude is in any particular area. The difference between this and the diverse departure is that in this case, the controller is going to give you an initial heading to fly until you get high enough that they will begin to vector you from that point. And so this is where you get the clearance that says, enter controlled airspace heading whatever, and or on takeoff, fly heading whatever. You still climb to 400 feet, and then you can turn, maintaining your climb gradient per the vectors until you get up into the Enroute environment. You'll see it listed something like this in the takeoff minimums section of the chart supplement. For example, at this airport, runway 16, you're going to fly a heading as assigned by ATC, but it requires a minimum climb gradient of 270 feet per nautical mile until you get to 1,000 feet. So you have to look at the climb tables and translate this into rate of climb based on your ground speed. So it's a little bit different because there's an obstacle out there somewhere they need to steer you around, but they'll do it with a radar vector. 400 feet, then as vector. The next level up of this sort of thing is what's called an obstacle departure procedure, and an ODP. Most pilots that I query in a flight review or an IPC know that an ODP exists. They haven't used them very much, most of them. Admittedly, many of my customers are biased here to the flatlands in the central part of the United States, but not all. And in most cases, I have to coach them a little bit about how to find an ODP that might exist. This chart here is a sectional view of the Beckley, West Virginia area with a lot of mountainous terrain. You can see some of the minimum altitudes at 4,500 feet to the east of the airport. You would anticipate some sort of obstacle departure procedure leaving the Beckley airport. We'll come back to Beckley in a moment. There sometimes, however, might also be an obstacle departure procedure even here in the Wichita, Kansas area because of not so much terrain out here, but because of towers. Or sometimes you'll be given an obstacle departure procedure that is really more based on maneuvering you out of the way of other airports that might be operating under instrument flight rules at the same time. So even if you're out here in the flatlands, it's a good idea to see if there is an ODP if you're going to be launching into instrument conditions. All right, who has to do an ODP? And we'll find where they are and what they mean here in a moment. 91-175 would suggest that if an obstacle departure procedure exists, you need to fly it. The reality is that Part 175, if you look farther down into that part of the regulation, stipulates that it only applies to Part 121 and 135 operators and Part 129 operators, which are transport category airplanes. So it's not going to be the rule for most pilots in M-class airplanes unless you're under 135. You don't have to follow the ODP. Further, the paragraph, entire paragraph only applies to part 125 as well as the other numbers. So it's not really directly addressing us. ODPs, unless you're flying under part 135 in an M-class airplane, an ODP is a highly recommended but voluntary procedure. Let's take a look and see what they're giving us, though. In the takeoff minimums here at Wichita departure, if you're taking off to the south, runway 18 here in the flatlands, we have to climb to 2,000 feet via runway heading. Now, field elevation is a little over 1,400 feet, so this isn't much higher than the initial 400 feet above ground level, but it is some. If you're heading anywhere from, if your departure is from south to west, you climb to 2,000 feet via runway heading before you proceed on course, and that's to avoid some towers that exist out to the southwest of the airport. If ATC's clearance says you are cleared as filed to the Las Vegas, Nevada, Las Vegas, New Mexico VOR or whatever it is out there, out to the west. If you get the word cleared as filed, what that means is you must climb to at least 400 feet before you make a turn, and it's highly recommended, because it's not mandatory for us, but it's highly recommended that you climb to at least about 600 feet above ground level before you make that turn because of the tower. ATC will assume that you will follow the obstacle departure procedure and not include that in your clearance. That becomes really important when you look at an airport like Beckley, West Virginia. Let's say that we're going somewhere up to the northeast, Leesburg, Virginia, or something, and we're going to do so via the Rennell VOR, which is up in the upper right-hand corner of this depiction of the sectional chart here. And we're going to take off from Beckley toward the south, runway 19, I believe it is. What should we do if ATC says November 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is cleared to Leesburg as filed, climb and maintain 9,000. All right. Sounds like, all right, I'll take off and turn left, go to the Rennell, which is how I filed it from Rennell and that on up, and then turn on course from there. But there's a lot of terrain out that direction that's substantially higher than the field elevation from which you're departing. So it's a really good idea not to go as filed, not to just turn right on or turn left on course and go as filed, but to take a look in the takeoff minimums to see if there is an obstacle departure procedure. And in fact, there is. If you're departing runway 19 from Beckley, it tells us to make a climbing right turn to heading 330 up to the northwest and climb to 4,400 feet before you proceed on course. We're going to do this, go straight ahead to 400 feet, make a right-hand turn to heading 330 degrees and climb to 4,400 feet, then proceed direct to the Rennell VOR. And your clearance from ATC will be, you are cleared to Leesburg as filed. It's up to you to do your homework ahead of time, find the obstacle departure procedure, and determine a safe way to climb out above the terrain before you can turn on course. Here's another one, standard instrument departure. Now, a lot of us fly SIDS. I trained initially in an era when the SIDS and STARS were sold in a separate booklet that almost nobody ever bought. And I remember being trained by my instrument instructor to put the words no SID, no STAR in the remarks section of my flight plan because I didn't want to fly these things because I didn't have the information on board the airplane. Now with the proliferation of electronic media, these are just as easily available to us as any other procedure. And I like a SID because the SID tells you exactly what you should plan to do and what you should expect to do. And if you have, as most of us do, a modern navigator, you can include that in your flight plan and it will depict it right there on the moving map. And for that matter, your autopilot or flight director can follow it so that you make it a very easy way to fly the airplane. So this is a standard instrument departure. This particular one is one that I've used many times when flying out of Addison, Texas, which is on the northeast end of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And so what does it tell us that we need to do? All right, I'm going to depart out of this airport and I'm departing runway 17. So it says climb on heading 174 degrees, runway heading, to 2,600 feet before turning. And then you make your turn and follow vectors. The reason you're doing that is to avoid these towers that are out here to the southwest part of the airport that you might not be able to see if you're in reduced visibility, or certainly if you've already climbed into the clouds before you get to those heights. And notice that the field elevation is 600 feet, 661 feet, and these towers are at 2384 and 2449 MSL. So they're pretty substantially tall towers. You really want to avoid them. From there, you start flying headings via vectors to whatever your route was. So your clearance would be that you're cleared to depart via the SID. If you are told as part of your clearance that you will fly, you're cleared to depart via the Kingdom 8 departure, and they'll give you the fix that you're going to depart the procedure from. If you're given this in your clearance, then it's part of your clearance and you have to fly it. And that's a really good idea. I personally go ahead and file a departure, a SID, as part of a departure out of an airport where SIDs apply. Again, so it's easier for me to plan ahead what they're going to want me to do instead of having to scramble to get it loaded into the box if they give that to me as part of my clearance after I've started up. All right. So what we're really trying to do is to avoid some obstacles by going to specific waypoints along the departure procedures identified in the SID document. From there, radar vectors, and then the procedure tells us that we're going to go, I'm going to be departing back up to Wichita, so I'm going by way of the Wichita Falls transition. Wichita Falls is out to the northwest of the Dallas area. And so the procedure tells me to go from, after the radar vectors, eventually I'm going to be cleared direct to the Maverick VOR and then depart on a radial off of that up to Wichita Falls and then en route on home from there. I've flown this out of Addison many times. I've flown it out of Dallas Executive, used to be called Redbird, which is southeast of DFW. I've flown it from a couple of airfields, Meacham and a private residential community out to the southwest of DFW. And I always get assigned this departure. Even if I hadn't filed it before I started filing it, I always got assigned, so I just started filing it. And it always has you go eventually to the Maverick VOR and then on course. Well, if you've ever driven in or out of Dallas-Fort Worth, as you're exiting the airport headed southbound on the highway, you go past the Maverick VOR. It's directly over the center or between the runways for DFW. And frankly, you never actually go there. The last place they want you to be going at reasonably low altitudes in a piston airplane or even a single engine turboprop is directly up and down the final approach course or departure path of the main runways at Dallas-Fort Worth. Now, you do have this available in case of lost communications. You know exactly what to do. The reality is every time I've flown this procedure, I've been assigned this procedure and I've flown this procedure, when we get to the radar vectors point, they will send me to some other fix outside of the DFW class Bravo airspace and en route from there. But it gives you an idea of where they expect you to go unless you're told otherwise. And it gives you something to do in the event of lost communication shortly after departure. So it's really important to take a look at a SID to see if it is going in the direction you want to go and prepare for that before you take off as well. Now, relatively recent, many years ago now, but still relatively recent addition to the terminology related to SIDs is climb via. In a climb via approach, the approach chart will have what's called a top altitude. Sometimes it will give you a specific altitude, 8,000 feet, 15,000 feet. Uh, Other times it will tell you, as is depicted on this one, assigned by ATC, in which case they will tell you as part of your clearance, you're cleared via the Kingdom 8 departure, top altitude is 8,000 feet. If they tell you climb via, then you take off, follow the appropriate routing, and climb to that top altitude unless they give you a restriction below that. You don't have to wait to uh, be told what altitude to fly to. And in fact, they will not tell you that over the radio as part of your clearance. My experience personally in a piston airplane, maybe they do it differently to the jets, maybe they do it differently to the M-class people, but flying an A36 Bonanza, maybe they have stereotypical assumptions, and they always make it very clear specifically what altitude they want me to fly to. But they could say climb via, and I fly to the top altitude or any other restriction they apply. Again, take a look at this before you get into the airplane, include it in your flight planning so that you do not have to try to figure this all out once the propeller's spinning around, and certainly not after the airplane's in the air. Other types of procedures exist. This one's out in Salt Lake City. I picked it because it's a little bit unusual. It has you depart and fly a heading to climb to a specific altitude, in this case 7,500 feet, then back to the VOR, which is directly on the airport grounds, to proceed en route from there. And this is because of the high terrain all around the Salt Lake City airport. Basically, regardless of the airport, the runway that you depart, they want you to get out over the Great Salt Lake. Not going to be any obstacles in the middle of the Great Salt Lake, so it's a safe place to be climbing. And you continue your climb out there until you're high enough that you can go back to the VOR and then go whatever direction you're cleared to go from there. So again, take a look and see what exists out there. And I wouldn't want to be trying to decipher all of this takeoff minimums language on the chart while I'm sitting there after the engine is started and I'm ready to taxi. And I absolutely don't want to have to figure out what it all means once I've got the airplane in the air. All right, so a SID, like any other instrument departure, always starts with a climb to 400 feet above the departure into the runway, at least 200 foot per minute, for 200 foot per nautical mile, unless the procedure tells you you need a higher climb gradient. And once you reach that 400 feet point, follow the SID as you've been cleared. The fifth type of instrument departure is really a visual departure in instrument conditions. You're on an instrument flight plan and you're on an instrument clearance, but you can ask for and be cleared for a visual climb over the airport. This is especially handy in very mountainous terrain where you might not have a climb gradient in your airplane to be able to go directly someplace, and there might not be a lot of room for you to maneuver except directly over the airport from which you departed. So if you're going to places like this particular photo is actually in Switzerland, but if you're going to places like Angel Fire, New Mexico, or Crested Butte, or places like that, you might be better off. You might have a better, a safer departure if the conditions allow, if you're in visual conditions, to simply climb over the airport until you get to a safe altitude before you turn along your cleared route. And so that's what a visual climb over the airport is all about. So this one in particular at Gunnison, Colorado, has a VOCA charted. You'll see it in the takeoff minimums where you would look for obstacle departure procedures and other things. And you see down at the bottom, it says the VOCA, visual climb over the airport. For either one of the runways, first, obtain ATC approval for climb in visual conditions when requesting your IFR clearance. Air traffic control cannot suggest that you ask for or that you accept a visual climb over the airport. You have to be the one to ask for it. And you need to ask for it when you request your clearance. Clearances is in my case, Bonanza 5043 Sierra Juliet, IFR Jabara, request visual climb over airport. And then it will come back. 504 Sierra Juliet is cleared to the Wichita Jabara Airport via visual climb over airport to whatever altitude, then as filed. So you ask for it, they include it as part of your clearance. So you ask for it, then climb in visual conditions, in this particular case, to cross the Gunnison Crested Butte Regional Airport at or above 10,000 feet. So you take off, and as soon as you can safely do so, turn back toward the airport, cross over the airport at or above 10,000 feet. If you can't get to 10,000 feet, by the time you get back to the airport, climb over the airport to 10,000 feet. Once you are at that altitude, then you follow a radial to inbound to a VOR, and then climb in a holding pattern over that VOR until you get to whatever cleared altitude or the MCA for your route of flight. So you could potentially be doing two holds, one being a visual hold, really just to climb over the airport until you get to 10,000 feet, and then an actual holding pattern procedure over the VORTAC until you get up to your cleared altitude before you turn en route. And guess what? They also are going to require some higher climb gradients because there's a lot of terrain out there. So runway 6 standard refers to visibility requirements for those airplanes that are required to have minimum visibility, part 135, part 121 for an instrument departure, but we have to have a minimum climb rate of 500 feet per nautical mile until 9,500 feet, or you have to have substantially better ceiling and visibility to be able to get that VOCA assigned and fly it. And this is either you've got to be able to stay out of the clouds and see really well, reasonably well for a good climb, or you have to climb really rapidly because you need to have terrain clearance assured. Right? And you climb in visual conditions, and your job then is first to ensure that the weather minimums are met and or that you can maintain the climb gradient specified. Then you have to request and obtain ATC approval to be able to fly the VOCA, VCOA. And you still should climb to at least 400 feet straight out before you make your turn. It's not absolutely required in this case because some visual climbs might require you to make an almost immediate turn. And it's also going to be heavily dependent upon your particular airplane's climb capability. But unless you prove in your flight planning otherwise that you can't fly that far out before you turn, fly to straight ahead to 400 feet, then begin your visual climb, in this case, back over the airport. Climb visually over the airport in this case until you get to the altitude and comply from the procedure with the procedure from there, from 10,000 feet over to the VOR, hold over the VOR until you get to your final altitude, and then off you go. ATC is still going to say you're cleared as filed via the visual climb over airport. You need to know all these details ahead of time. The last of the 6 ways to get out, it's very similar to a diverse departure in that there is no specified way, but it is what I call a do-it-yourself instrument departure. Now that sounds rather casual, but the reality is that this may require more planning than something that's already charted for you, because you need to sit down with the charts and figure out what's going to get you out of there safely. It might be that for whatever reason, you do not or cannot fly the obstacle departure procedure for a particular airport, or you cannot fly the standard instrument departure, and you might put in your flight plan that you don't want, no SID. You don't want the standard instrument departure. In this case, you have to figure out ahead of time what will get you safely from the ground up into the en route environment. So you'll still be cleared as filed Sometimes they'll give you a intercontrolled airspace on 120 degree, whatever heading or whatever. It's your job to see what's going to keep you out of those windmills and everything else. This is what you're looking at when you're making a do-it-yourself departure. What is going to be a safe way to fly out of this airport, presumably in reduced visibility conditions, and still safely get up to the en route environment? So the way you do this, at least in my opinion, the way to do this is you're looking at your instrument and route charts, your low altitude and route charts at this point. But what you really want to look at is the sectional chart, because this is going to give you more detail about terrain, heights. Instead of just listing minimum altitudes, it will show you where the towers actually are, where the hills are, what the elevations are at various locations, and draw yourself a way to get out of this airport. You might even put it on draw it on the approach chart for the airport that you're departing, because you can use geolocation and keep an eye on yourself on that. It's not the best way to do it. You want to come up with better navigational ways to do it. But pick yourself some headings and altitudes that will get you out of there if you are not choosing to use some charted method of departing the airport and you can't do it entirely visually. You have to figure out your own way out of there. So wrapping it all up, flying an instrument departure always, with the possible exception of that visual climb over airport, you're staying in visual conditions, but it always, in my opinion, starts with a wings level runway heading climb to 400 feet above the end of the runway. From there, if it's a diverse departure, hit 400 feet, go whatever direction it takes you on your cleared route. If it's a diverse vector area, from that 400 feet above ground level point, you turn on whatever heading that they've assigned you to fly. If you are told to do this, oh, I already said that, fly the heading that they tell you to fly. If there's an obstacle departure procedure, climb straight ahead to 400 feet, then begin flying the obstacle departure procedure as described in the takeoff minimum section of the chart supplement. It might have you climb on a particular heading until you reach an altitude, and then from there proceed to a fix and then as filed. If you are flying a SID, it's really sort of an advanced version of the obstacle departure procedure in that it's actually charted for you and included as part of your clearance. So always fly to 400 feet, then whatever procedure applies. If you're doing a visual climb over the airport, I still like to do the 400 feet minimum. That's not very high above ground level. And then fly the visual climb as listed in the chart supplement until you get to where you can go along your route as filed. And then lastly, you do it yourself is very similar to the other types, except that you have actually, before you get into the airplane, you've looked at the charts and you've picked a specific heading or a fix to fly toward and safe altitudes to fly until you get up into where you can turn en route. The trick to all of this, however, is that with the exception of the SID and the visual climb over the airport, ATC is not going to include this information in your clearance. They're going to tell you, yeah, you're cleared to Leesburg as filed. And it's up to you to know that instead of turning left, I'm going to turn right and climb away from my route until I get to an altitude and then turn back at it, if that's what it is, like, for example, out of Beckley, West Virginia. So do your homework. Which particular type of departure applies to the airport from which you are leaving in the conditions that you're leaving in? Fly straight ahead to 400 feet above ground level and then proceed from there. Map out the whole thing, whether you're doing it with a charted procedure using your navigational database or you're doing it on your iPad or even on paper. Figure out ahead of time what you're going to do before you get on board the airplane so you'll know how you're going to make this instrument departure. Evaluate yourself objectively. And when it comes to flying IFR departure, flying departures in instrument conditions, I have a couple of things that I like to think about. When you fly an approach, you've been in the airplane for a while. You've had time to know that the airplane is working correctly and that you've programmed the navigational devices correctly, and you've had time to make sure that, yes, you're really up to speed. You are at the top of your game. You're able to fly the approach procedure. When you're making an instrument departure, you don't know any of these things yet. So I tend to be pretty conservative about instrument departures myself. I use circling minimums unless I'm in a rare case where I do that nearby departure alternate, like I talked about at Chattanooga. Because you really don't know yet until you get in the clouds whether or not the gauges are going to hold up, or you have properly programmed the navigator, or that little nagging headache hasn't suddenly turned into a big problem you didn't anticipate because you weren't in the air yet. So be very cautious about making any departure into instrument conditions or at night, even in visual conditions, uh, because you don't know yet whether you're able to handle it and if the airplane's really working properly, and that you're going to be able to catch any errors that you might have made and compensate for any aircraft discrepancies while you're close to the ground in poor visibility. Know and use your technology. I'm a big fan of using what sometimes called the toga button, the takeoff and go around button, or the go around button in a lot of the airplanes that I fly. When you click that go around button in most light airplanes, the flight director will command a wings level, straight ahead climb at about 7 degrees nose up, which is really close to a good um, VY departure speed, at least initially. The plane will usually accelerate beyond that, but it's a good target for that initial 400 feet of climb. So line up with the runway, click the button, and now you've got a positive target to aim for with attitude and heading. Just stay within the boundaries of the flight director, and it will take you where you need to go. This also goes to a concept that I teach sometimes, and I won't get into it in detail here, but I call it build complexity, and that's the idea. Don't try to go from zero to full autopilot coupling in one swift mode. I like to go at it slowly. I'll engage the flight director, and in this case, I've turned it into I hit the go around button. Now I'm in the air. I can hit heading and climb, vertical speed in my case, and the flight director will adjust for that, but I'm still hand flying the airplane. Now I've confirmed that it's doing what I want it to do. I can hit the autopilot button, as opposed to hitting the autopilot button and having that famous "what is it doing now" moment. But back to the topic at hand here. Make sure everything's set up and ready to go. Use your flight director if you have one, and I like using a positive target as identified by the go around button or the toga button on a lot of airplanes. So are you truly proficient, and do you know how to use your avionics? If you can't answer those questions affirmatively, it's time to get some dual and to be more restrictive on yourself. Maybe avoid flying instrument departures at all. Is the airplane in top shape? We already talked about. And are you in a condition and able to catch yourself or the airplane close to the ground at IMC if you have to? All right. Talked about the pitch attitude for initial climb out, wings level, straight ahead, VY attitude, or a little faster in most airplanes, at least for that first 400 feet. If you planned your instrument departure and you fly your plan, obstacle clearance takes care of itself. All you need to do is fly airspeeds and attitudes and configurations, and the airplane will perform as you want. Follow the rules about departure restrictions. Give yourself an out in case something does go bad. And don't launch into conditions that give you no good options if a failure occurs, or again, if you've made a mistake. Launching into low IMC in high terrain on a hot day in a heavy airplane, too many things are going badly on you. You can manage that risk by waiting for cooler weather, or waiting for better visibility, or reducing the airplane's weight, or a combination of all of those. So wrapping it up, we manage our instrument currency, and the FAA evaluates our instrument capability based primarily on our ability to get down from the en route environment. everything that is included in the regulatory requirements for currency is related to approaches and holds and the navigation required to do so. The long list of items required to be demonstrated on an instrument proficiency check does not include any mention of proficiency in making an instrument departure. So we measure ourselves as instrument pilots based on the number and recency of the instrument approaches we have flown. I suggest that, at least informally, you add another column to your logbook, IFR departures, and keep track of how frequently and how recently you've departed into instrument conditions and what those conditions were, so that for your next flight plan, you can objectively evaluate whether or not you are as proficient as you think you might be in making low IFR departures, and manage the risk, establish personal minimums based around your currency in this column as well. The National Transportation Safety Board investigates all aircraft accidents, or at least a perfunctory investigation of all aircraft accidents under its mandate from Congress in the United States. Things generally don't break in airplanes. Generally, the issues that result in NTSB reports are the result of the pilot's planning or lack of planning, or their proficiency or lack of proficiency in flying the airplane. So please think about departing in instrument conditions as really a whole separate category of proficiency and training that all we instrument pilots need to work on all of the time, and know the different types of instrument departure procedures. Thanks very much for listening, and I think Mike's going to come back on and see if we had any questions.
Tom, thank you very much. That was a fascinating webinar, a really good review. Learned some new things myself. And I think that your point about knowing your avionics is really critical. I've talked with a lot of our members, and they've invested quite a bit of money in their panels. And I asked them what they like to do best, and it's press direct to and just fly direct. Having a full understanding of capability.
When I do an IPC, I actually do, because I've identified over the years this is a common gap in knowledge, the departure procedure planning. I include that in the briefing for an instrument proficiency check. But I actually, if one does not exist, and that one here at Wichita doesn't really exist, I mean, it's climbed to 2,000 and turned, I've got a couple that I've made up, and I will give to the pilot when we schedule for the flight. Say, this is going to be our obstacle departure procedure for the airport, and I will have them brief and fly that to me. And many of the folks that I fly with in IPCs have done, like you've said, they've invested a lot of money into the panel of the aircraft, and so a lot of the IPCs that I perform over the last few years have been a combination of obstacle departure procedures and teaching them at least one new thing about how to use their avionics. That go around buttons, a lot of people don't know how that works or why that works. That's a good thing, you know, how to load in an uncharted holding pattern also. But I think we're facing, our demographics are facing the same thing. We invest a great deal of money in some extremely capable equipment, and then the challenge becomes, how do we actually get the safety and utility benefit out of what we bought?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And a lot of us have Garmin avionics in our aircraft, and PMOPA will be having a member-only Garmin training for the GTN, the G1000 NXI, and the G3000 at the end of June in Olathe, Kansas, at Garmin's headquarters. We'll also have a tour of Garmin and a barbecue. So great opportunity.
I've gone through that training up there twice. The instructors are excellent. The hardware that you use is active. You can program flight plans and everything. Have you ever been up there?
Not in their training center, I've not taken a course. I've been there, but I've seen it, but it's pretty amazing.
It really is. It's a great way to learn how to use the avionics. Like a lot of instructors are going to say, sometimes with the avionics there are three different ways to do something, and I'd rather just let's all focus on one. I can learn the variations later,
Yeah.
but it's a great way to learn how to use those avionics.
Yeah, that's great. And Tom, you may not be aware, but Zoom is having some technical issues this afternoon. So we've had a host of members who weren't even able to get in. I can't see how many attendees are on or their names, and there's nobody who has put in any questions, which tells me that it's not a functionality if people don't have questions. I think that's probably related to the Zoom challenges, the technical challenges they're having today. So I think that the content you provided is excellent. As you and I talked about before, this will be recorded. So if folks have questions, may I ask that they just email me directly at mnichols@pmopa.com, and then I'll work with Tom to try to group the questions and get some answers. And perhaps we can do it another follow-up phone call or something of that nature to facilitate some Q&A. Just I feel terrible about the technical difficulties. It's not on our side. It's Zoom. There's some news stories reporting on that. It seems to be
Really?
a widespread thing that's impacting a lot of folks. So,
Okay.
Tom, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate your expertise. You're sharing that with us and your continued steadfast commitment to increasing safety in the general aviation community.
Well, thanks for letting me be a small part of the great things that you're doing at PMOPA too as well. Thank you very much, Mike.
Great seeing you. Thanks, Tom. Take care.
Bye.